Thank you for inviting us here today. It's really nice to be with you, and it's actually nice to see some other acupuncturists here, actually being interested in what we've got to say. So, I actually first came to acupuncture quite a few years ago. I was in a quite stressful job, and it really took its toll on me. I was suffering from insomnia and other issues, and I went to see an acupuncturist, and the effects of that treatment sort of really blew me away. So much to the extent that I gave up that sort of well-paid, secure job with the pension and the flexi time and the holiday leave to go and be a full-time student and do a degree in acupuncture. And when I was looking at this, sort of preparing for this presentation, it occurred to me that nobody ever comes to me and says, I'm here because I'm grieving. What they come with is the after effects of the grief, the stress, and the impact that has in a wide range of issues on the body. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is, well, a few things: the common questions that people ask about acupuncture, and the general sort of Chinese health tradition, a little bit about stress, and about how acupuncture works. So if I look at the things people most commonly say to me, and this is where I find that I can't actually move my slides on, just a moment. There we go. There's three things. Does it work? How does it work? And what does it work for? And the does it work, I think, is the ties in very much with the Western way of thinking, that it seems so strange that you put a tiny needle in somebody and it creates a reaction somewhere else in the body. But it's, acupuncture has been recognized for many years by the World Health Organization as a system of healthcare. More recently within the West, within this country. And, nice guidance at the moment, particularly for chronic pain, is there for acupuncture. So it's definitely happening. In terms of what does it work or how does it work, there are a number of ways. We know that sticking a needle in the flesh creates a reflex elsewhere in the body through the nervous system. We know that it can change the neurophysiology, that it can change the biochemistry of the body by releasing opioids, endorphins, and a number of other chemicals, and through a weird thing called purinergic signaling, which basically takes the energy systems of the body, the ATP and adenosine, and sends signals from one cell to another, which seems a really weird thing, but it's well researched and is definitely there. I think where people often get stuck on acupuncture is the description of it as an energy medicine. And this is something that used to really confuse me because, I for many years I taught yoga, and I did my teacher training at a place called Mandala Yoga Ashram, which is in South Wales, and it's a very traditional ashram. So everybody's dressed in orange, they've got the shaved heads. The focus is very much on meditation and breathing practices. And they kept talking about energy. So they'd be saying, feel the energies of the morning, feel the energy of the bird song, feel the energies of the earth. And I thought, what on earth are they talking about? It all sounds very nice. I don't really understand it. And so I came back to Yorkshire and I spoke to a number of yoga teachers who I knew. I said, what is this energy? Can you explain it to me? And I got all sorts of highfalutin answers. And in the end, I was no wiser, really. And I went back to the ashram and I asked Swami Nishalananda, who's the head of the ashram, to explain energy to me. And he said this: energy is a concept that explains how everything in the universe works, including us. And the interesting thing is, when I was on this mission to find out exactly what energy is, I also asked a nuclear physicist who's handling my cousin's boyfriend, and he said pretty much the same thing. It's just really about how things work. So, we may look a little bit strange in acupuncture in that we talk about things like yin and yang and 5 phases and vital substances, and about organ and channel theory, and about how you can, touch a place on the body and it transmits to somewhere within. Whereas Western medicine will perhaps talk about biochemistry and nerves and hormones, but in effect, they are two ways of looking at just the same thing. So in Chinese medicine, in a very simplistic sort of way, we talk about organs and we talk about their relationships with each other. And we have a nice flow of energy around the organs, or of how the physiology of the body works. And sometimes that goes astray. And in that case, the little arrows will be pointing in all sorts of different directions or going backwards. Now, each of the organs in Chinese medicine, because it's a holistic practice, we don't separate mind from body, has an emotion attached to it. And the organ that ties in with the emotion of grief is the lung. And the lung has all sorts of functions in Chinese medicine. I've listed just a few of them here. There are many, many more. But basically, the lung is the place where we take in our qi. We take oxygen from the air, and then we pass it around the rest of the body. It has a strong connection with the heart, both being in a place we call the upper jiao, the upper part of the body. And it passes all fluids around and regulates everything that we do, all physiological activities. So if something goes wrong with the lung, then we're potentially in a little bit of trouble. And I'm not going to talk too much today about how we improve lung function. And I think that Dave is going to do some sort of practical session with us, hopefully. I hope so, because I've done this sort of thing with him before and it's brilliant. But in sort of simple terms, the things we do to improve the lung function are to breathe. And sometimes it's helpful just to be aware of your breath. So if you want to, you can just pause for a moment now. See how your breath feels. Notice whether it's moving quickly in or out of the body. And the breath is quite an unusual function in that, unlike many of the other automatic functions of our body, we can actually consciously control it. We can decide whether we breathe more quickly, more slowly. And often when we're in times of grief, the breath will tend to focus itself in the upper parts of the body, from that sharp intake of breath when you have a loss, the interrupted breath that comes with sobs, to that general fight or flight response where we breathe very slowly, very quickly, very shallowly. But we can change that by focusing on the breath, starting to make it a little bit longer, a little bit deeper. Another thing you can do to improve lung function is to exercise. And we'll talk about exercise later on when we talk about the Chinese health traditions and choosing an exercise that's appropriate for you. So it might be that you want to do a bit of yoga, a bit of Tai Chi, or it might be that you prefer to do something a little bit more vigorous, whatever works best. And then the third thing is posture. So often when we lose someone, we'll tend to slump forwards to close in around the rib cage, and that inhibits our breathing. So to resolve that, we can think about taking the shoulders back, taking them back down the back of the body, opening up the chest, allowing expansion for the ribs and the lungs to take in breath. And the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was the stress response, because it's there in so many illnesses nowadays. And there's been a recognition, I think, in recent years that stress is a big factor in many illnesses. There was a time when body and mind were completely split in Western terms. That's changing now, even though the stress response is something that's been known about for years and years and years. And one of the first people to write about that was a medical doctor called Hans Sale. And Hans, when he was a medical student, he was only 19 years of age when he first started studying this, was in his lab, and he was given a number of people to look at who were suffering from a wide range of illnesses. So from kidney problems to digestive issues to musculoskeletal things. And he realised that something very similar happened with them. And it wasn't in the first stages of stress, because stress is a normal response. We all get stressed, and it might be that workplace stress, where there's something very sort of physical, emotional going on. It might be an emotional stress. And it's worth mentioning that stress is not necessarily something that's negative for us. We can become stressed by things that we enjoy. An excess of entertainment, of stimulation can cause stress. It's when that stress becomes prolonged that we have a problem. So, the first stage is the body will respond to stress. It will look to getting rid of it. And we'll talk about some of the ways of doing that a little bit later. But if stress goes on for too long, what Hans Sale found was that it has three main issues, three main things happen in the body. The first is that the adrenal cortex increases in size, and the adrenal cortex is a tiny little thing that sits on top of your kidney. The cortex is the outer layer of it, and it releases hormones. And amongst those hormones are the main stress hormones like cortisol. So if you have an increase in the size of the adrenal cortex, the amount of cortisol introduced into your body also increases. The second thing that Hans Sale found was that organs of the immune system decrease in size. Things like the thymus, the lymph nodes, they reduce. So you're not as able to fight infections and disease. And the third that happens is that there's an increase in stomach acid. And that in turn leads to ulcers. So in Chinese medicine, obviously we use acupuncture to deal with biochemistry and signals from nerves to organs. But there's a very heavy emphasis in Chinese medical traditions or health traditions about keeping healthy and strong. And we have a tradition called Sheng, the nourishment of life tradition. And I've listed here just 4 elements of that: diet, exercise and rest, sleep, mind and emotions. But it is a bit more wide ranging from that. So it also covers things like childbirth and becoming a new mother, about aging and how we die gracefully, and also about the one I love best, something sort of rather niftily entitled Affairs of the Bedroom, which you can work out yourselves. So if we look at these in turn, when we think about diet, obviously the world was very different when Chinese medicine was first in being, in that we didn't have fast food restaurants, there wasn't a McDonald's on every corner, there was no processed food. You basically got what you had. And we talk very much about the stomach in Chinese medicine and how it receives, rots and ripens, a phrase that I absolutely love. But what we need to do is to enable the body to do that and to do it well. And there are a few things that we can think about. The first is timing. And that can be in terms of when you eat. You'll have all heard the phrases about breakfasting like a king, lunching like a prince, and having supper like a pauper. That basically your stomach is better set to receive food first thing in the morning. And you can also look at the size of your meals. So, again, culture where we have so much dietary advice now, and a culture where people are generally expanding in size too, unfortunately. So when I talk about size of meals, there's the issue about when you have them, the larger meal at the beginning of the day, the smaller meals later on, but also about being in tune with your own body and knowing when you feel full. And tying into that is my third point, just eat. And I'm not talking about a delivery service there. It's about making time to eat, about allowing your body to process the food that goes into it. So if you think about the nervous system, and I'm sure you've all heard about the fight and flight response, the rest and digest response. If your body is in fight and flight response, it is not going to digest your food as well. You won't have the proper enzymes there. It won't be as open to receiving. So other than sitting around a table with friends, colleagues to eat your meal, think about just eating. Not looking at a webinar such as this when you're having your lunch, not reading, not watching the TV, just taking the time to eat, and you can treat it almost as a meditation. And eating the fresh, wholesome food probably goes without saying. And I'm not talking about any fancy diet here, just looking at what's there, what's freshly available. And in Chinese medicine, we haven't got time to definitely go into this now, but we do look at maybe adjusting the diet to the individual. But it's not a major wholesale change, not a eat goji berries and you'll live till 110. It's a slight tilt of the diet to fit the individual. And then the next thing that's so important in healthcare is sleep. I think when people come into clinic, insomnia is actually something I see very, very regularly. It's important to differentiate between what's true insomnia, a person who simply can't sleep, and what's insomnia that's caused by something else that's going on in their life at that time. And obviously, grief is something that will impact most people's ability to sleep. Not everyone. I have had, people in who have suffered a loss, but have somehow managed to still sleep a regular 8 hours. So one of the important things there again is working with the rhythm of life and going to sleep at a time when you're tired, waking when you're early. In a society where we have access to stimulation pretty much every hour of the day, it's difficult to do that sometimes. And there have been studies that show that the amount that people sleep has actually reduced significantly over the last few decades, from about 8 to 9 to 10 even hours a night down to about 5 to 7. So prioritizing sleep is really important, but it can help to get into a system of regularity, to go to bed at the same time, to wake up at the same time. But if you're suffering, if you're grieving, that sleep is not there, it might be that you feel tired in the afternoon, and I would say go with that. Many cultures operate with a system of siesta. If you suffer from insomnia in this country, quite often the advice that you're given is to really restrict the amount of time that you can sleep, to maybe, try and sleep for 6 hours, 5 hours, and then expand it. And I can tell you from somebody who first came to acupuncture suffering with insomnia, that is a hell on earth to try and, sort of restrict your sleep so that you can sleep more. So I would say, at this particular time when somebody's grieving, the important thing is to sleep when you feel that you can sleep and try and get that rhythm going of a natural bedtime. And then the third thing on my list of the Chinese health tradition items is exercise. And again, the Western way of thinking is often that if you exercise and it's good for you, that more exercise is even better. Now, the Chinese way is not too much, not too little, and to balance exercise with rest. And the way you can tell whether you're doing too much or too little is really about how you feel afterwards. So we're talking Chinese medicine about concepts called excess and deficiency. And we could think about somebody in excess maybe as a stressed businessman or woman who's released a lot of cortisol during the day and they need to get rid of it. So if they go out for a run on a night and run 5-10 miles, they might feel absolutely fantastic at the end of it. If we have somebody who's deficient, who's lacking in certain things, and they're really tired, going out for that run is going to have the opposite effect. They're going to feel absolutely shattered at the end, and that fatigue will just grow and grow over time. Now, many Eastern health traditions have methods of exercise, things like yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, and they're all brilliant in that they not only sort of stretch and strengthen muscles and also stretch the fascia of the body that tends to hold a lot of tension, but that they integrate the mind and body through breath and through awareness of what's going on in the mind. So, at times of stress, of grief, they can be really helpful when especially when those sort of heavier types of exercise just feel too much. And then the last thing of all in the Chinese health traditions is the mind and emotions, but it's not last and least. In many ways, this is the most important. And here, it's important to recognise that grief is a natural state. As you'll see in the Chinese proverb that sweet, sour, bitter, pungent, all must be tasted. We will all experience grief. There is no getting away from that. But the thing to do is to express that grief, feel it, whether that be that you do that in meditation, through talking with somebody, talking to friends, talking to professional people, through exercise and allowing it to release in that way, but one way or another to allow those emotions to flow freely. Because as the other proverb says, that, worry and grief, illness, if we don't do something about it, don't let them go, will be experienced in the body. And again, we'll come back to acupuncture and how that can help. So, we're in this duality of yin yang, 5 phases, etc., as opposed to the Western way of thinking in biochemistry, pure energetic signaling reflexes. But they are 2 sides of the same coin. They are working in the same way. And where acupuncture can come in is it can help to balance the body. It's been shown to regulate those hormones, and it can help people cope with things just a little bit more. So thank you for your time today. And with that, I'll hand over to Dave, who tells a little bit about chiropractic.
Thanks, Jane. And firstly, I would wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. Looking at the body holistically has got to be the way forward for an intelligent healthcare system. And obviously, Chinese medicine has been around for thousands of years. And as I once saw a presentation in when I was at chiropractic college, it was actually at a medical school, and there was a medical professor talking about how Western medicine has made great strides forward in so many disciplines, and that all of that affords us in our Western societies is incredibly privileged. Invariably, it is based upon a kind of reductive approach. We find what's the organ that's not working very well, and what are the tissues that are not working well in that organ, and what are the cells, what are what we could even go subcellular, if you like, and try and intervene at whatever lowest common denominator position to try and make a difference to that person's well-being. The challenge with that approach, of course, is that no aspect of your body works in isolation, and that we are not just reductive beings, and that those cells talk to other cells, and those tissues talk to other tissues, and those organs talk to other organs. And that person talks with other people. And so this very, I think, enlightened medical professor was talking about how do we look at healthcare from rather than a reductive approach, but flip that on its head, and how do we look at that organ in relation to the other organs? How do we look at that those organs in relation to how that person lives, how they sleep, how they exercise, what they put in their mouth, what they put into their minds, what do they expose themselves to, how do they manage stress in their life, what interaction have they got with the biosphere, what's their quality of their food like, how do they find joy, what's the relationship to themselves and their families, or their past and their history, or to the things that they're finding stressful. And I think that's a more joined up way of looking at healthcare. It's incredibly more difficult when we've got a system that invariably is looking in that reductive model to start looking at the person in that holistic way, and having conversations that are perhaps a little bit different from what bit hurts. How do we intervene at that bit that hurts? There's an old phrase in chiropractic, which is, there's two relevant ones. If you're in the place of pain, you're probably in the wrong place. And aligned with that is, if you stand on a dog's tail, the bark comes out of its mouth. It's not the mouth that's the problem. That's the bit that's shouting the loudest, but it doesn't mean to say that, we're going to get great strides if we're just looking at the mouth that's making a lot of noise. And we've got to be able to look at the bigger picture of health and well-being. And I'm very fortunate when I have trained, and I'm continually training and learning about healthcare from a biopsychosocial aspect, or chiropractic from a biosocial psychosocial perspective. Rather than just thinking about, okay, this person's got a tight low back and it's hurting them and the pain's radiating here or there. I'm much more interested not only in how is their posture, because of course, or maybe it's not of course, depending on your perspective, how we hold our upper body is going to affect our lower body. We can't take that in isolation. How our legs work or don't work, and our feet, how they work and don't work, is going to affect every other aspect of our body. But not only that, how is that person carrying tension in their body based on how tension has been in their life? And with practice, when we palpate people, you can get an idea of how tough has the paper round been, how has life been. And it's sometimes we have a stress questionnaire in our intake forms when I see people for the first time, and sometimes it always I find it interesting when people leave that bit blank and say, oh, I don't have any stress. And really, our bodies are a bit like a blueprint for how we've perceived life. So we'll have you'll maybe come across the work, the body keeps the score, that, our bodies embody the stress and strain of life, and it tells a story, and it shows a picture. So obviously, with one of the most stressful things we could ever experience, and sympathies, of course, to anybody who, if is either on this call or watches this call afterwards, that he's going through a grieving process. I'm not here to say that we've got a magic pill or a magic adjustment that's going to manage or cure grief. It is, as Jane says, it's part of the tapestry of life. But what I do see and what I do know is that there are some common threads with people who are undergoing some level of grief or some process of grief, and one of those things is, of course, sometimes to be very heady and to not necessarily feel as though they've got the space or the capacity to be able to express emotion. So we'll sometimes disappear into our head, and sometimes those are kind of repeating thoughts and rumination. And sometimes also people don't look after themselves because they're the ones perhaps holding it together for other people, and they don't feel as though they've got the space or the capacity to look after themselves as much, and so kind of plow on regardless. And that regardless of the stressor, but obviously one of the most acute ones, and chronic, is going to be grief. Regardless of that stress, if it just gets bottled up and bottled up and bottled up, then eventually something goes. And I over the years have seen many people for whom their back pain or their neck pain or whatever else has come out of the blue. I don't get it, because all I did was picked up a pencil and my back went. And it invariably, there's a backstory to back pain or neck pain or whatever else pain for that matter. And that backstory always interests me, because often it's that accumulation of stuff we've put to the back of our minds and we've not had the space, the capacity to deal with, that builds and builds and builds. And then before long, we might see that affect our posture. Jane talked about that kind of hunched over posture. It's often associated also with a kind of forward head posture and a closed off. It's almost like we're defending ourselves against the world. And sometimes we're defending ourselves against our emotions or the stuff that we can't control. The reaction to our body is the same. It's that embodied stress. And whilst I don't work or claim to work with mental emotional things or aspects of life, what I do know is that as people's tissues unwind, as people's nervous systems unwind, as their musculature loosens, their posture can change. And sometimes when our posture changes, our outlook changes. Some people in personal development have maybe come across this idea that sometimes even a change in lifting our head up a centimetre or two can really affect not just our outlook as how far can we see, but actually our outlook in how objective can we be. And I see that when people's posture changes, that often their outlook in life changes. The way in which we hunker down and hold tension, as that changes, then often people find more resource and resourcefulness within themselves. Because in my belief system, I think we've got all the capacities and all of the strengths that we need in life. Sometimes they've been a bit locked away. Sometimes they've been a bit hidden because they've been overburdened by all the stress and strain of life. And really, chiropractic in its purest sense is about allowing the innate intelligence, the innate wisdom that's inside all of us to flow freely through a spine and a nervous system that is optimal, that's loose, that's flexible, that allows us to adapt to the challenges of life in the best way possible. It's quite simplistic, really, in that sense. And I think there's something to be said for that. So the way in which I practice chiropractic is there's lots of different ways in which you can practice chiropractic. What most people are familiar with is a kind of a manipulative kind of Rice Krispies approach: snap, crackle, and pop. Get a joint into tension, give it a little nudge, and allow it to move and move more freely, and that's great. Lots of different ways in which you can do that. There are also techniques that don't involve the cavitation of joints, but more work tonally through the spine, looking at how that person is presenting, what's the tone of their spine and their musculature and their fascia, and helping them to connect and release that themselves. That is a technique that one of the techniques that I practice. But they all work, and they all work for people, but not every technique works for everyone. But it's a fundamental if you like, principle in nature, that the more our spine and our nervous system works, much as Jane was saying, much as our energy is flowing, that we tend to feel healthier and happier. So the way I wanted to approach this talk was a little few words of explanation, and also just to do a little exercise, which I do give to people in our practice to help us to be a bit more whole. And I guess when we're going through a grief process, and or a stressful life process, again, we can kind of make this disconnection between brain and body, or mind and body, or mind, body and spirit. If we go back to Descartes, whenever Descartes was around, he coined this idea of Cartesian dualism, where the brain is separate from the body, because he wanted to cut up cadavers to be able to work on them and understand how the human body works. And the brain, that was God's, and he managed to convince the church that they were separate. And that's kind of infiltrated a lot of healthcare, certainly Western healthcare, for many centuries. But we all know, hopefully, that that's not the case, and that we are mind, body, and spirit. And the more we can be whole, the better. Certainly, that's what I see in my work. So one of the things that I alluded to before was, our inability sometimes, if we're stressed, to look after ourselves and recognize what's going on with ourselves, particularly if there's emotions there that we don't want to go to, we don't want to acknowledge. But that actually creates a lot of tension to do that. So as we're going about our day, if we're actively trying not to experience our life, we have to almost crumple up and tighten up. And an archetype that I sometimes use is, if you imagine somebody standing guard outside of Buckingham Palace, say, and loads of people in front of them trying desperately to make them laugh or smile or giggle or move or whatever, and they're doing whatever, pulling silly faces, but the person on guard is there just stony faced and rigid. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of mental focus to kind of keep in that posture. And they're very, very good at it. The challenge is, when they get off guard, do they still hold that posture? Do they still hold that rigidity? Do they still have that flexibility and that ability to be able to acknowledge who they are, how they are, and how they're going through their life situation? Because, as Jane has talked about, our emotions affect every aspect of our life, how we carry tension in our body, but also our biochemistry. So our emotions arguably are supposed to create change in our biochemistry. If we feel fear, then that's designed to get that rush of all of the hormones that Jane talks about, so that we can get out of that situation because it's challenging. So if we negate our emotions, then we suppress them, then perhaps we're also suppressing our body's ability to function optimally. So I'm not saying that we should go around all sobbing around or being angry with people, but just being appropriate and being real with where we're at. So hopefully there'll be a few questions, but let's just keep it simple rather than me talking anymore, and invite you to participate in an exercise if you would like to. Obviously, not if you prefer not to. It's a simple breathing exercise that's going to involve you becoming aware of 3 particular places in your body: at the top of your chest, up by your collarbones, the bottom of your sternum, so where your sternum becomes your abdomen, and then over your belly button. And purely and simply, although there's lots and lots of depth to an exercise as simple as this, is to place both hands over your body in that place, and just to breathe into that place. Now, if you like, your hands give you some feedback. So again, I'm going to do this, and Jane has kindly volunteered to do this with me, and I'm going to talk it through with Jane. If, as much as possible, I can see where you're putting your hands, that would be great. If the camera won't allow, then let's not worry too much. And again, join in if you would like to. But purely and simply, if we're going to place hands on top of your body, ideally with your palm on top of palm, not so much like this. This is a bit broad. I want you to kind of focus up where your collarbones are. And if you're comfortable to close your eyes and just to breathe into where your hands are, and take a few breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth, purely to check in with, what do you feel in this place? And you don't need to answer, you don't need to say anything, just to breathe and notice, what do you feel in this place? Now you might feel the breath lifting your hands. And breathing out through the mouth, you might feel that it feels tight or restricted. It might feel expansive. You might feel that you can feel the breath go up into your upper shoulders. You might feel that all the breath leaks down into your belly and it doesn't go into where your hands are. Try and keep it focused where your hands are. And notice things like, how present can you be with your body here? How connected do you feel? How much movement is there? Do any old thoughts come up? Do any emotions come up? Just connecting as much as you can to each breath. And then take your hands and place them in the place just at the bottom of your sternum. So the center of your palm is going to go at the bottom of your breastbone, and then the center of the other hand is going to go over the top of that one. Lovely. And then just take a few breaths into this place. In through your nose and out through your mouth. And first of all, notice what's different here. What's different from the top? In through your nose and out through the mouth. Is there more or less connection? More or less focus? More or less distraction? Tightness? Again, thoughts or emotion? There's no right answers. And then bringing your hands over the belly button. In through your nose and out through your mouth into this place. And noticing what you feel as you breathe into there. And again, bringing some awareness to, how is this place different from the middle or the top? More or less movement, more or less presence. So it may move more readily because there's not ribs in the way. But is there the same level of presence? Is there the same level of focus and attention? Or is there more distraction? And then whichever of those three places felt like there is the most peace, then bring your hands there, top, middle, or bottom. And again, there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. Just trust your intuition of where is the most peace? Where does it feel like there's the most connection? And we're just going to expand some more breath into there. So if you're doing this along the way, just breathe into that. And if you can, really tune into that sense of peace as you're moving your hands. If you're feeling the breath expand, you might even get this sense of, as Jane talked about, a sense of energy. And notice it on the in-breath, but also notice it on the out-breath. So if nothing else, hopefully we're focusing on and accentuating a level of peace, of connection, and more integration between mind and body. And then we're gently going to find whichever of the other places was more tricky to connect to. Might be because you were more distracted, or it might have just felt more rigid or tighter. Just place your hands there. So whichever one of those places it was, and that's fine, Jane. And then breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, and just acknowledging the tightness. So in a Western sense of exercise, we might say, okay, let's push this out because it's tight, or I can't connect here, so I'm going to force it. Resist that temptation and just breathe into the tightness. Breathe into the resistance and just acknowledge it. You could even in your mind or out loud or as a whisper, you might just acknowledge that sometimes I feel disconnected here. Sometimes it's difficult to connect here. Or sometimes it feels tight here. And then notice what happens with your breath when you give it that acknowledgement. What happens to the tissues, the tension, when you acknowledge it? Sometimes I hold on here. Sometimes I don't want to let go here. Sometimes it feels safer not to connect here. And then go back to the place of ease, wherever the most peace was. And then a few breaths into there. And wherever you find the most peace, wherever you found the most ease, that's where you want to start and that's where you want to finish. Most of us could do with a bit more peace and ease in our life, and yet it's something we don't focus enough on. We're always on to the next thing that's not right and we need to fix or need to sort out. Coming back to that place of ease and presence and connection. What I find in practicing this and helping other people to practice, it helps us to be a bit more whole, a bit more integrated, helps our nervous system to calm down, come out of that state of fight, flight, or freeze, and bring some resourcefulness to whatever stresses and strains that we're going through at that time. I hope that can be useful for people. Jane, we could carry on, but we're not going to. I'm aware of time. I'll probably round up there and invite any questions.